Welcome to the podcast Stories from Palestine. My name is Crystal and I invite you to join me every week for interesting, inspiring and unexpected stories from Palestine. 7 years ago, I moved from the Netherlands to Palestine to be with my Palestinian husband. We live with our 2 children in Beit Safafa, a town between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. We run a cafe and a bar in Bethlehem. And before the pandemic, I used to take tourists on alternative tours to learn about the reality of life for Palestinians in the West Bank. As the world is in lockdown due to the pandemic and we cannot receive any tourists at the moment, I decided to share stories from Palestine as a virtual tour. And maybe one day when the world opens up again, you will be inspired to come and discover the beauty of Palestine yourself. I created the website storiesfrompalestine.info and the Facebook page Stories from Palestine, where you can find links, photos and background information. You can subscribe to my podcast so you will never miss an episode. Subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or go to buzzsprout.com with double Z and search for Stories from Palestine to find the other podcast platforms that this podcast is listed on. And now, get ready for a new episode of Stories from Palestine. Today's episode is about monasticism in the Jerusalem desert. I know, that may sound pretty boring, but I promise you it can be quite spectacular if you understand what really happened here in the Jerusalem desert. And as an enthusiastic guide, I'm going to take you on a virtual journey to an incredible part of Palestine that I hope you will come and explore yourself one day. I don't know if everybody is familiar with the term monasticism. A monasticism is a religious way of life in which someone devotes him or herself fully to spiritual work and usually doesn't own personal belongings and often lives in seclusion away from the society. If you visit Palestine today, you will have the chance to visit several monasteries that date back to the first centuries after Christ and that are still or again functioning as a monastery. They are often beautifully built on and into the rocks and therefore quite a spectacular sight. I will post some photos on my website storiesfrompalestine.info. In the second episode of my podcast, I talked about my obsession with caves. I know that may not sound very exciting, but the caves of Palestine are wrapped in incredible stories. If you love stories, you will love the caves. And if you haven't listened to the caves episode, I recommend you to do so, episode number 2. Many of these caves were found in the Jerusalem desert, also known as the Judean desert. This desert stretches between the mountain ridge that connects Jerusalem to Hebron in a northwest line and the Dead Sea. So it is the area to the southeast of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is about 700 meters above sea level and the Dead Sea is at 330 meters below sea level. This means that the Jerusalem desert descends about 100 meters in height over a stretch of only 30 kilometers. And even though I have an obsession with the caves and especially the stories that evolved around the caves, I do not have the same obsession with the desert. Actually, the opposite is true. I love water and I love green. I love grass and trees and plants and flowers and bushes, and that's what I miss about the Netherlands. Plus my bike. Yeah, but now I live in Beit Safafa, on the eastern side of Jerusalem, right where the landscape changes from the greener mountain ridge area with a Mediterranean climate to the more arid, dry desert climate. Most of the rain that falls between October and May falls on the western side of the mountain ridge. The rain shadow side on the east receives much less rain, and that is why the area is so dry. Now, when you think about the desert, you as the listener to this podcast, what do you imagine? How do you see the desert? What are the words that come to your mind? What is a desert like? Because deserts differ from place to place, depending on the natural circumstances, the type of rocks and soil. I was in Morocco in 2010 in the Sahara Desert, and that was just sand, forever sand, wherever you looked, sand dunes. The Jerusalem Desert is not sand. It is mainly stone, rocks, it's barren, nothing grows there, but you see the rolling hills. Even though it descends down towards the Dead Sea, it is not a flat area. And the area has many valleys. They're pretty deep valleys. The valleys are created by the springs that are at the foot of the mountains and the hills between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And these, I must say, are quite spectacular valleys. In the winter time, they can flood. When it rains a lot in Jerusalem, the water goes down with incredible speed and it can catch people by surprise. Every year, there are several hikers that did not expect those flash floods and they are washed away by them. Even though we can have different ideas about what a desert looks like, we probably all agree that the desert is a desolate place, a place with very little life. And actually, that is not completely true for the Jerusalem desert. Once upon a time, more than 1500 years ago, this desert was inhabited with an estimated number of 10,000 people. These people did not live in a city or in towns. They were either dwelling on their own in natural caves, or they were living in a community with others, but closed off from the outside world. And we refer to them as the Desert Fathers. They were monks that chose to abandon their families, their properties, their life in society to dedicate their life to God. They would leave absolutely everything behind and move without belongings into the desert. They came from different locations. Some of them were locals, but many came from further, from Egypt, from Cappadocia, which is current-day Turkey, from Syria. And so the Jerusalem desert became a spiritual city. And it was not for no reason that it was in the Jerusalem desert that monasticism became so popular. It is the same desert where, according to the Bible, Jesus spent 40 days fasting in the wilderness, and then he was tempted by the devil. And if you are familiar with the Bible stories, it may be interesting to know that it was in this desert that David would hide from King Saul, and that prophet Elijah was fed by the ravens during a 2.5 years long drought, which was a punishment by God for the sins of the people. These Bible stories were all very important for the monks who chose to follow in the footsteps of these important biblical figures. Besides the fact that the monks were drawn to this desert because of the biblical stories, the Jerusalem desert is also just very suitable for monastic life. It has several features that make it perfect for these desert dwellers. First of all, we said it, the existence of natural caves. The caves offered protection against the heat of the summer, cold of the winter, and against wild animals. Another interesting feature of this desert is that even though it is on the rain shadow side of the central mountain ridge, and it doesn't rain very often in the desert, it still has water, spring water. And of course, water is essential. Without water, the monks would not survive. There are a number of springs in the desert. These springs are fed by rainwater that seeps down in the mountains until it hits an impermeable layer that does not allow the water to pass through. The water will then flow over this layer until it reaches a place on the Earth's surface where the water comes out in the form of a spring. The spring water on the Earth's surface becomes quite a big water stream in the rain season, and over a long period of time, these streams created deep valleys. And these valleys are called wadis in Arabic, and they run all the way from the mountain ridge until the Dead Sea for about 30 kilometers towards the lowest point on Earth. Another important fact was that even though the monks would dwell in the desert, they would still know that beyond the hills there were Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The distance to Jerusalem was generally always within 1 day of walking, so that made it more convenient. And even though they lived a remote life, there was the possibility to connect to the outside world and even sell products to have an income for the monastery. So these are the reasons that explain why the Jerusalem desert was such a popular destination for monastic life. The biblical stories, the presence of water, and the closeness to two important religious cities. The monks that moved to the desert basically had three options for how they wanted to live in the desert. The first option was to live and dwell in complete solitude as a hermit, totally alone and away from the society. These hermits would have to forage for food. From early historical descriptions of the lifestyle of these hermits, we have quite a good idea of what they would be eating. Their diet was usually vegetarian or even vegan. They would forage for plants like gobeze, which is mallow in English, lupine, chickpeas, lentils. They could carry and keep dried fruits and nuts with them, like dates and apricots and almonds. And with herbs such as sage, maramiya in Arabic, and wild thyme, za'atar, they could brew a cup of tea so they can stay warm at night or in the winter time. But many of the monks would actually eat very little, or they would keep days of complete fasting. I actually found this conversation. It was written down by a monk called Evagrius Ponticus in the 4th century after Christ, and he says, "Once I visited Saint Macarius at noon, and burning with thirst, I asked for a drink of water. But he said, 'Be satisfied with the shade, for at this moment there are many travelers who lack even that.' Then I was telling him of my difficulties in practicing self-restraint, and he said, 'Take heart, my son, for during the whole of 20 years, I myself have never had my fill of bread, water, or sleep. But I have carefully measured my bread and water and snatched some sleep by leaning a little against the wall.'" I'm just trying to picture these monks. On medieval paintings, we see them depicted with very long beards, sometimes reaching the floor, and they are usually depicted wearing a cloak. Slender, they probably didn't have many opportunities to have a good cleaning wash, so it must have been a very challenging lifestyle. There were also monks who chose to live a more communal life together with other monks in a monastery, or as they call it, a cenobium. They would take a vow before God, denouncing any material possessions and committing their life to prayer and devotion and hard work, because these monks would not only meditate and pray, they were self-sufficient within the walls of their monastery. So they would grow their own food, they would make baskets, ropes, and do other handicrafts to be completely independent. On the door of the well-known Saint Theodosius monastery here close to Bethlehem, on the edge of the desert in a town called Alobadia, there is a sign that Theodosius himself put up above the entrance that says, "Let no lazy person enter." That's how important working was to them. 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of work and 8 hours of prayer and Bible studies. The third way of monastic life was a combination of the two I mentioned. So the monks would stay in separate caves alone throughout the week in solitude, but then they would come together on Sundays for a church service, and then they would share a meal together. They could also then supply for the next week to come. We know that they would use a double-baked bread called paximadia, a hard bread of Greek origin, which could keep good for a long time. So they would have enough for the next week when they were in solitude in the desert. Actually, in Palestine today, there's a similar hard-baked sweet bread that is called kershella. My children like to eat this in the morning. They dip it in warm milk to make it a little bit softer for breakfast. The caves where these hermits were staying, each one in their own cave, were usually forming a path or a line in the wadi, so the caves were essentially connected to each other by a path. And there was one central area where they would meet in the weekends. And the Greek word for path is laura. And so this type of monasteries became known as laura. The main monastery of this laura type was not walled off like the cenobium, it was more accessible. And the monks used to come in the weekends and spend time together. Both at the cenobium, the monasteries, as well as the laura type, they used to receive and host pilgrims. And there were many pilgrims that visited the Holy Land. They came from all over the world. They spent days with the monks in the desert to learn about the desert life and to learn from these desert fathers. It was actually a part of the income of the desert fathers. We know that at some point there were 10,000 monks living in the desert, and there were around 65 different monasteries. Now, only one of these monasteries has continuously been inhabited from the year it was built in 483 until today, and that is the Marsaba monastery. It's a fantastic monastery built on a steep rocky cliff. The many structures that were built around the first defensive tower, they seem to hang from the mountain. They have different shapes, different heights, and all this forms a spectacular, organic-looking cluster of buildings, as if they were dug into the rocks. You can see some photos of this monastery on my website. The Marsaba monastery, as well as the St. Theodosius monastery, they can both easily be visited from Jerusalem or Bethlehem. They are both situated close to the Kidron Valley. Now, the Kidron Valley is believed to be the location where the final judgment of God will take place in all three monotheistic religions. So for Jews, Christians and Muslims alike, the valley that comes out from Jerusalem and descends to the Dead Sea is very important because it is the place where God will do his final judgment. Saint Sabah, the founder of the Marsaba monastery, was a special man. He was living the monastic lifestyle already since he was 8 years old. He came from Cappadocia, current day Turkey, and when he turned 18, he traveled to Palestine because he wanted to live as a hermit in the Jerusalem desert. Now, it had become a tradition to start the hermit life in the desert by first spending some years in a cenobium together with other monks to get used before moving on to the more isolated life. So that's what Sabah did, and by the time he was 30 years old, he finally started his time alone in the desert, and he lived in caves, he wandered around. For about 14 years he lived like that. There is a great story about Sabah. One day, Sabah left his cave for some time, and then when he returned, he found a lion in his cave. And the lion didn't look very amused at the sight of Sabah, but Sabah trusted in his God. He did not feel any fear, and it is said that he tried to persuade the lion that they could share the cave together. Now, the lion wasn't really convinced, or maybe he was just really hungry. So Sabah was, okay, I have to look for another weapon. And then he took out his Bible and he started reading to the lion from the book of Psalms. The lion wasn't impressed by this act, but he probably just got really bored with him. He got up, left the cave, and didn't harm Sabah. And this story was told between the people in the area, and since then, no bandit has ever tried to harm Sabah because it was known far and wide that Sabah had been victorious over a lion. Sabah was also a very pious man. According to another story, one day he had an apple in his hand. And it must have been something special because apples naturally do not grow in the desert or anywhere in this area. So he looked at the juicy apple and it looked delicious and so tempting. But when he realized the feeling of temptation, he was reminded of how Adam and Eve had been tempted to eat the apple from the forbidden tree in the Garden of Eden, and how that had led to their fall. And that's when he decided he would never eat an apple. And since then, apples have never been allowed into the monastery until today. So the monks that live in Marsaba monastery today do not eat apples, nor do they eat meat. They deprive themselves in general of luxury and temptations. And these temptations also include women. Women are not allowed in the monastery. Sabah had a special tower built across from the monastery for the female visitors. He would even host his own mother in the women's tower. She never set a foot in the monastery. It's even said that if a woman visits the monastery, there will be an earthquake. And that might sound like a legend, but local people will tell you that one day a woman disguised in men's clothes was trying to enter the monastery, on which very moment the earth shook and her true nature was revealed. Monasticism in the Jerusalem desert had an abrupt end, and actually a sad end. Except for the Marsaba monastery, all the monasteries suffered from attacks and destruction by the invading Persians in the year 614. The Persians back then were on a mission to enlarge their empire, and when they reached Jerusalem, they were so angry that Jerusalem did not want to make an easy truce that they besieged it and killed every man and woman and child they could catch, or they captured them and they took them into exile. This is the year in which most monasteries were destroyed and many monks were killed. It is said that they killed at least half of the 10,000 monks in the desert. Some of the monasteries have been rebuilt. Visitors to Palestine today can visit the Theodosius Monastery in Alobadia, the Marsaba Monastery, the St. George Monastery in Wadi al-Kelt with a beautiful hike through the valley, the monastery in Jericho at the Mount of Temptation, and Deir Hajla Monastery, which is north of the Dead Sea. And in most of these monasteries, you will find a display of the skulls of the monks that were massacred by the Persians in 614. You can find photos and further information and links on the most beautiful monasteries of Palestine on my website, storiesfrompalestine.info. Monasticism in Palestine has never again reached the same popularity. Today there are only a small number of monks in the existing monasteries. And honestly, it is really hard to imagine such a life in isolation, especially in these days of modern technology where we are always connected. Although I see now, especially in these times of the world pandemic and with all the uncertainties, that there is a longing for more spirituality, a search for meaning of life. Yeah, but then nowadays, in order to find peace of mind, people would rather look for an application on their phone to do some mindfulness meditations rather than go looking for a suitable desert cave. because we know that you can only really understand another country by its language, every episode we end with teaching you something in Arabic. And Louisa, my daughter, is going to help me because her Arabic is much better than mine. Louisa, when people want to say hello to somebody in Arabic, what do they usually say?
Marhaba.
And what is the answer to that? If somebody tells you marhaba, how do you answer?
Marhabtain.
Marhabtain. And do you know what that means, marhabtain?
Two. Hello. 2 times marhaba.
In Arabic, you add ain, the sound ain, if you are talking about something that is dual, that is twofold. So, for example, a girl, bint, 2 girls, bintain, more than 2 girls, banat. A boy in Arabic is walad. 2 boys is waladain. And more than 2 boys is ulad. Marhaba, hello. And then when you answer marhabtain, you actually say 2 hellos back. And Louisa, you can say to somebody marhaba and you can answer marhabtain. But what else can you say to somebody to say hello?
Ahlan wa sahlan.
What does that mean, ahla wa sahlan?
Welcome.
And Louisa, what we also hear, especially when people are a bit more religious, is
Salam alaikum.
if somebody tells you that, what do you answer?
Wa alaikum salam.
And salam is peace in Arabic. So when you say salam wa alaikum, you say peace upon you. And if you answer wa alaikum salam, you say and upon you peace. Hadi, marhaba.
مرحبا.
أهلين.
أهلين.
كيف حالك؟
كيف حالك؟
السلام عليكم.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
وعليكم السلام.
Thank you for listening and learning Arabic with us. You have been listening to Stories from Palestine, a podcast that focuses on history, cultural heritage, and stories from Palestine. You can subscribe to Stories from Palestine on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or search Stories from Palestine on buzzsprout.com and find all the other podcast platforms that this podcast is listed on. You can stay connected with me and my guests on the website storiesfrompalestine.info and on Facebook and Instagram. That's where I post photos, links, and more background information. I really appreciate donations to support this podcast, especially during this pandemic that brought a complete halt to the tourism sector. You can find my PayPal account on the website, Facebook, or in the show notes on Buzzsprout. paypal.me/chrisjustice. I look forward to you joining again next week for another episode of Stories from Palestine.